Saw me and he fled. Okay, why don't I get started? First, a disclaimer. I have no idea what I'm talking about. This is, I am not an expert on any aspect of Leibowitz's work, whether it's theology or philosophy, and certainly not biochemistry. But he is an important public intellectual in Israel and very well known. And I was a little surprised that more people in the US were not familiar with his work. So I'm performing a public service on behalf of the multitude that is gathered here and those watching at home. And I'm displaying a picture of a t-shirt that you can buy online with his picture. He is readily identifiable, at least to Israelis, by his kippah, by his lantern jaw, and his scowl. And below it, in case you can't see it, it says, Amarti lechem, or I told you. And we'll get into what that is intended to mean. So there are dozens of books and articles about him, comparing and contrasting his ideas with other philosophers, theologians. And if you go on YouTube, there are many personal appearances that he did on Israeli television. They're all in Hebrew, of course. There's also a very interesting lecture by Micha Goodman comparing his ideas to Abraham Joshua Heschel's. He's sort of presenting Heschel as the dominant thinker in American Judaism and suggesting that Leibowitz is a greater force in Israel. If you're interested in reading his works, there is one excellent volume in English that captures a lot of his best essays, published by Harvard. And if you know Hebrew, there's even more. Quick biographical note. Yeshayahu Leibowitz was born in Riga to a religious Zionist family. He studied chemistry, medicine, and philosophy in Berlin and Basel and immigrated to Palestine in 1935. Several years after his sister Nechama immigrated to Israel, Nechama is a greatly beloved commentator on the Bible. You'll see her works on the shelf here. Universally beloved. Her brother is not universally beloved. He was a polymath, to be sure. I would call him a Renaissance man, but I'm not sure he would take that as a compliment, since he would have taken issue with the humanist philosophies of the Renaissance. He was a professor of biochemistry and neurology, and he also lectured on philosophy and the history of science, and is reported to have been an electrifying lecturer. I've seen a clip of Daniel Kahneman describing how he was sick with a high fever, and he still dragged himself to the lecture hall because he didn't want to miss it. So he remained an Orthodox Jew, and he lectured on Torah and philosophy and on various other subjects on the radio in Israel. So he was very well known through these broadcasts. And he remained active in public life until his death in 1994. And his status as both a scientist and an Orthodox Torah scholar and a committed Zionist gave him a unique platform and a unique stature, because he could potentially appeal or be accepted by all of those constituencies. But he also drew a lot of attention because of his polemical style and by his cranky nature. I mean, he was a character. I'm going to cover his main ideas in three areas: Jewish religion, the relationship between religion and state, and the effects of state policy towards the Palestinians and the effects of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The last subject is the one that made him a hero to some and a traitor to others. But he posed questions that are still relevant to us, that we're still trying to answer. And the reference to Amarti Lachem is a reference to his views on the occupation. So we'll start with his views on the Jewish religion. To Leibowitz, the idea of having 7 gates would have been a joke. To him, there was only one gate, and that was to assume the yoke of mitzvot for the sole purpose of honoring God. That is, following halacha lishma, as they say, for its own sake, and for no other reason. Not because it makes you feel good, because it solves some personal or societal problem, solely for the purpose of honoring God. And he contends that the history of Judaism shows that faith grounded in halakha is the essence of Judaism. It is the reason why Judaism has survived. I'll read you a quote. It is an empirically confirmed fact that Judaism as a distinct historical phenomenon preserved a constant identity, maintained its community over a period of 3,000 years, and was embodied solely in the mitzvot systematically structured in the form of halakha. Only by virtue of the halakha was Judaism delimited as a single, independent, and autonomous unit, distinguishable from others. So halakha is what made Jews Jews for thousands of years. Without it, what would have made us different than any other people? And given his attitude about mitzvot as being the only method of serving God, it becomes pretty clear that the God that Leibowitz conceives of is Rambam's idea of God. It's an idea of God as being perfect, as being outside of nature, and being essentially unknowable. All we know of God is known indirectly by observing the effects of God's activities. God does not perform miracles, does not get involved in the affairs of humanity in any way that we can understand. And therefore, the only way for a Jew to serve God is through performing the mitzvot that God has mandated. One assumes this obligation purely as a matter of faith and not with any expectation of reward, spiritual or physical. Mitzvot, therefore, are intentionally not a natural way to live. It is a system that is intended to liberate Jews from their natural inclinations. In his words, halakha is an expression of religiosity which rejects all illusion, does not entertain man with the vision of some target at which he may aim, and which once attained constitutes the fulfillment of his tasks. No human achievement affects the regime of religious practice under which one lives from coming of age until death. Performance of mitzvot is man's path to God, an infinite path, the end of which is never attained and is in effect unattainable. You work towards the ideal, but as ideal you will never reach. Or as Leibowitz put it at other times, we look for the coming of the Messiah. The Messiah will always be coming. And if you think about it, I thought of the conversos in Spain and Portugal who maintained their Jewish identity in secret. How did they do that? They did it by secretly lighting Shabbat candles, reciting blessings, avoiding eating treif. It was through mitzvot that they maintained their connection to their Jewish identity. Without the mitzvot, what would they have had? What would have perpetuated them? Just a thought. Taking this view of Judaism leads to some interesting interpretations of stories in the Tanakh. We read the Akedah story every year, and every year I personally recoil when I read it. I think that's a natural reaction among us. And yet for Leibowitz, the Akedah is the quintessential act of faith. It is the perfect way to serve God because it is a demand that all of your natural inclinations are denied in favor of service to God. When God said Lech Lecha to Abraham the first time, he presented Abraham with a future. When he ordered the sacrifice of Isaac, he not only was spelling the end of Abraham's future, but his past, his entire identity. He was asking him to sacrifice everything in the service of God. Fortunately, this is only a goal to strive for, and not a level of observance that we hope to reach. It is presented to us as the ultimate, as the perfect way to serve God. And there are other readings which can be seen in this light. The story of Job. Job is a pious man. He follows God, and then every blessing in his life is taken away. And he is alone, without any possessions, and he's sick, and yet he still maintains his faith in God. So there are parallels here to the Akedah. God, he says, I did not sin against God, and yet God has done this to me. I still believe in God. His companions all say to him, surely you must have done something wrong. And then at the end of Eov, God says, actually, Job is right. He didn't do anything wrong, and the reasons why I'm punishing him are none of your business. Sadly, we know from the beginning of the story of Job what God's reasons were, and they're rather unfortunate. But the point is, Job's belief in God was unconditional. And even Kohelet, which, when I've read it, I've always assumed that the very last chapter of Kohelet, which says, okay, nothing lasts, life is transient. The important thing is to obey mitzvot, to live a life, with God's law. To me, that always seemed like it was tacked on to make it acceptable for Kohelet to be included in the canon. But for Leibowitz, it's just the opposite. That really is the point of the story, that you reach an end where you are in despair, and this is the relief from despair. So if halakha constitutes Judaism, then you have to recognize the role of people who are shaping it. Now, what is halakha? Most people think of Shulchan Aruch as being authoritative. But the rabbis were not gods. They disagreed. The rules have changed over time. Leibowitz is not troubled by the fact that this is the work of human beings and not of God. Because he recognizes that the oral law was developed with the intention of honoring God, that the differences were all in favor of realizing in the best possible way service to God. And while that process cannot be perfect, may not be perfect, it is still sufficient to guide us. And It enables us to perform mitzvot under some changing circumstances over time. One problem with that is, as Leibowitz points out, because the oral law was developed at a time when Jews had no political power, it doesn't really address issues that would arise if they did. And more about that later. Now, as far as prayer goes, we have a siddur, which provides the texts which are the obligatory prayers we're required to say. That is not to preclude praying to God on your own and in your own words, but they are not a substitute for reciting the required obligatory prayers. The idea of changing prayers over time, as conservatives do, as Reform Jews do, to suit the moral or aesthetic spirit of the times, he finds totally illegitimate. And nor is the idea that prayer is intended to achieve a certain outcome through God's intervention. So, for example, in the Shema, we have the first paragraph that sets the standard for belief in God, service to God, ve'ahavta. And in the first and the third, it provides practical ways to remember the mitzvot, tefillin, tzitzit, mezuzot. But we also have this second paragraph, which kind of creates a problem, because it seems to be premised on the idea that your crops will grow if you follow God's law, and they'll dry up if you don't. On that subject, pardon me, Leibowitz follows the example of Rambam in his explanation. He says, Maimonides is aware that the goal indicated in the first portion of the reading of Shema is, quote, an exceedingly high and difficult achievement which only the very few attain after highly elaborate preparation. That not all persons apprehend the truth as did Abraham, and therefore the masses have been permitted, in order to confirm them in their faith, to perform the mitzvot out of hope for reward, and to refrain from transgression for fear of punishment. In other words, this is a concession to the fact that for many of us, the Torah lishma, performing mitzvot lishma, is an ideal that we are not ready for. And therefore, the Torah makes allowances for that and gives us the notion that we will be physically and spiritually rewarded for performing them. But that this is an idea that as you perfect yourself, you will abandon, you will no longer need it. How does this compare to other forms of the Jewish religion? I mean, this one is rather it's rather severe, but in comparison, and this is a quotation from Leibowitz about both Reform Judaism on one end and Kabbalah on the other. He says, Reform Judaism, in Reform Judaism, for the service of God through Torah and mitzvot as the end of religion, the Reform movement substitutes an end the Jewish people is destined to attain. And paradoxically, in this respect, Reform resembles the Kabbalah, except that the Kabbalah assigns to the Jewish people in Judaism a cosmic metaphysical vocation, tikkun olam, namely the rehabilitation of the world, the rectification, as it were, of a breach of the divine realm itself, taking on some of God's work. Moreover, the Kabbalah endeavors to maintain the halakhic system as it is, ascribing the practice of mitzvot a magical efficacy towards fulfilling this religious function of repairing the world. Reform Judaism, by contrast, assigns to Judaism a human mundane vocation to be a light unto the nations. Accordingly, it adopts the mitzvot in ways that seem most appropriate to this end, or even abrogates them when they seem superfluous or dysfunctional to that vocation. What is common to Kabbalah and Reform is the dissolution of faith lishma, Torah lishma, and worship lishma, which are the very essence of historical Halachic Judaism. These are then replaced by faith, Torah, and service for the sake of redemption of the Jewish people, of the world, of humanity, and thereby empties Judaism of its religious content entirely. Other approaches that are popular in this country among Jews, consider Martin Buber. Now, Leibowitz does not criticize Hasidism because it doesn't deviate from halacha, but only adds a new way of creating a halachic-based community. However, to Buber, in my humble opinion, and Leibowitz's, one could say that Buber seemed to regard halacha as an impediment to developing an I-thou relationship with God, which is the ultimate purpose of Judaism in Buber's eyes. He extolled Hasidism for its emphasis on ecstatic joy and charismatic experience, but his Hasidic tales barely even mention halachic practice. So it is essentially a non-halachic theology. With Heschel, and here I recommend the lecture by Micha Goodman on YouTube. He notes that Leibowitz was asked to participate in a project to translate and publish Heschel's work in Hebrew, publish it in Israel. He said he had no interest in spreading his meager, anthropocentric, sentimental religiosity. Now, Heschel, of course, was a halachic Jew, but he's one that emphasized radical amazement. It's a term we've all heard. Radical amazement is a path to getting closer to God. Halakha was one road to developing a spiritual relationship with God. And for what purpose? To fulfill the prophet's vision of social justice. So to Leibowitz, this once again is God in service to human feelings. Now, well, I won't talk about Mordechai Kaplan. I think you can guess, but there might have been an issue. Now, to move on to religion and the state, Leibowitz wrote an influential set of writings dealing with this. He did not see how rabbis could continue to function as religious leaders once they became civil servants. The focus of the chief rabbinate and the religious parties is extracting resources from the state for parochial purposes of the Orthodox community. It is also imposing halachic rules on people who don't believe in them. While to Leibowitz, ideally, the decision to accept the yoke of Torah mitzvot is a personal choice based on faith. If the religious community was going to be an influence on life in Israel, it could only do it by maintaining its independence from politics. To emphasize his reason for having misgivings, Leibowitz recounts a meeting that he had with David Ben-Gurion. And we are accustomed to hearing that Ben-Gurion made concessions to the Orthodox community because of guilt or sentimentality or nostalgia for reasons that may not have been entirely wholesome, but were basically, good, well-intentioned. But Leibowitz recounts Ben-Gurion saying this to him: I well understand why you demand so insistently the separation of religion and state. Your object is the Jewish religion reinstate itself as an independent factor, so the political authority will be compelled to deal with it. I will never agree to the separation of religion from the state. I want the state to hold religion in the palm of its hand. Leibowitz was a Zionist, but he attached no religious significance to Zionism. And the thought of doing so to him was an exercise in idolatry. Zionism was a secular political movement which arose because, in Leibowitz's eloquent words, we were fed up with being ruled by Goyim. Because of Leibowitz's religious beliefs, he believed that nothing on earth is holy. Therefore, there is no such thing as holy sites. The temple was a holy site only insofar it was the one place where certain mitzvot could be performed. But to treat the kotel, for example, as holy is sheer idolatry. In fact, he referred to it as the discotel. This is also a rejection of the idea of the state of Israel as Reshit Tzmichat Ge'ulatenu, which is what we sing every Shabbat when we sing the prayer for the state of Israel. Therefore, he regards the views of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, and also to some extent his father, Avraham Kook, as idolatrous by providing religious justifications for building settlements in Judea and Samaria. At an earlier point, Leibowitz considered the possibility that halakha could continue to evolve to provide guidance in matters of governance, in state action, sovereignty. But he abandoned the idea, especially as he saw the idolatrous and messianic tendencies of religious Zionist leaders. To Leibowitz, the Messiah will always be coming, a goal to aspire to, which will never be reached. In the meantime, halakha tells us how to live our lives day to day. Any notion that the goal of Judaism was realization of ultimate redemption in the present was an unholy usurpation of the role of God, which would lead to catastrophic results. And he had plenty of examples to show that that was true. Rabbi Akiva's participation in the Bar Kokhba revolt, Kabbalist doctrines that assign humans the roles of fixing God's work, the rise of Shabtai Tzvi, and then of Joseph Frank, Rav Kook's belief that the Zionists were unwitting agents of God, and the doctrines that deify the Jewish nation and fetishize the land of Israel. Now, finally, onto his political views, which are the most controversial and to me the most problematic, however much sympathy I may have with some of them. Most people in this country know of him because he was that Orthodox professor who opposed the occupation. He was strongly opposed to the occupation almost immediately after the end of the Six-Day War. And where did this view come from? It can't be traced directly to his religious beliefs, but rather out of his personal sensibilities and his idea of justice. He drew a distinction between religious practice, which was lishma, and civic ethics. He saw that the oral law was premised on the long-standing Jewish reality of living at the sufferance of foreign regimes, and that within our community, we adopted standards that would be challenging to maintain if we were in a position of power. And his great fear was that in the absence of Torah Lishma, there would be Medina Kedosha, in my words. In 1953, Leibowitz wrote an article called After Kibiya. I should explain what Kibiya is a reference to. In October 1953, Arab infiltrators from the area around the village of Kibiya in the West Bank reached the town of Yehud in Israel, where they killed a mother and two kids by lobbing a grenade into their bedroom while they slept. This was after a series of similar attacks in the area. The next day, an IDF force led by Arik Sharon attacked Kibiya, killing more than 50 people and destroying 40 houses. Leibowitz writes, bear with me a moment. Kibiya, its causes, implications, and the action itself are part of the great test to which we as a nation are put as a result of national liberation, political independence, and our military power. For we were bearers of a culture which for many generations derived certain spiritual benefits from conditions of exile, foreign rule, and political impotence. Our morality and conscience were conditioned by an insulated existence in which we could cultivate values and sensibilities that did not have to be tested in the crucible of reality. In our own eyes, we appear to have gained control over one of the terrible drives to which human nature is subject, the impulse to communal murder. While congratulating ourselves upon this, we ignored that in our historical situation, such mass murder was not one of the means at our disposal for self-defense or for the attainment of collective aspirations. From the standpoint of both moral vocation and religious action, exilic existence enabled us to evade this decisive test. However, values are precious to the extent that their realization is difficult and easily frustrated. This is the true religious and moral significance of regaining political independence and the capacity to deploy force. We are now being put to the test. Are we capable not only of suffering for the sake of the values we cherish, but also of acting in accordance with them? It is easy to suffer physically and materially, even to sacrifice one's life for their sake. This requires only physical courage. It is much more difficult to forego, out of consideration for such values, actions which promote other prized ends, even legitimate needs and interests. So he identifies what he sees as a dangerous trend. He believes that kibbutz was a consequence of treating national and political interests as though they were holy. If you believe that you are fighting a holy war, you are capable of acting without any restraint. Veneration of the state is the road to fascism. With regard to the territories, not everything that Leibowitz feared and predicted has come to pass. He could not have foreseen Sadat, the peaceful return of Sinai, peace treaty with Jordan, the Abraham Accords. But his primary concern is one that persists, the fact that the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza cannot be absorbed into the state as citizens and still have the state fulfill its primary purpose, Jewish sovereignty. He also assumed that Palestinians were no less determined to establish their own sovereignty at any cost, and therefore the only hope for a solution was, as in the past, partition, a two-state solution. He correctly foresaw the consequences of continued occupation and the results of policies intended to lead toward the eventual annexation of those territories. The persecution and brutality that are the hallmark of every occupation, every colonial regime, a moral disaster, non-recognition by the world of settlements and the world's opprobrium whenever settlements are built, the undermining of opportunities to end or minimize the conflict, increased criticism of Israel by enemies and former friends, violent resistance by the Palestinian inhabitants, no improvement in Israel's security situation, reliance on Arab labor, although that's not quite true anymore, and the attempted transformation of the Jewish religion into a camouflage for Israeli ultranationalism. It was at this point that Leibowitz used what I consider extremely intemperate language in describing his feelings about opposition. He said that those who supported the occupation, those who carried out the occupation, were the equivalent of Judeo-Nazis. And those quotes from him, unfortunately, live on in many anti-Zionist websites. He went too far. He was a polemicist by nature, and I think he just carried it too far. It was also at this point that Leibowitz first called for disobedience by soldiers called to serve in the territories. This call came right around the time that it was announced that he was selected to receive the Israel Prize, which is by far the most prestigious prize that an Israeli can get from Israeli society. Needless to say, the announcement was greeted with, denunciations. And Rabin, who was prime minister at the time, announced that he would not shake his hand at the ceremony. Leibowitz said he didn't really want the award anyway. He was accepting it because he didn't want to look like he thought highly of himself by turning it down. But under the circumstances, he said, I'll turn it down. So as you've probably noticed, different aspects of Leibowitz's ideas were at odds with the views of practically every single person in the country in one way or another. And naturally, in addition to those who thought him a traitor, there were those who resented the attention that he received. If you want to see an example of that, check Hillel Halkin's dismissal appraisal of him in the November 1994 issue of Commentary, where he attributes his high profile to the popularity of his anti-occupation views with the left-wing media, totally ignoring his other contributions. But unquestionably, his willingness to speak his idiosyncratic truth to the powerful was greatly appreciated and admired and respected, even by many of his opponents. The fact that he was even considered for the Israel Prize is a testament to the robust health of Israeli civil society. Thank you. Shayla, questions? Yes?
Thank you very much, David. Surely he was cognizant that Jewish law had evolved over time. He knew that Jewish law was influenced by the many cultures that Jews were in contact with, the evolving sensibilities of the Rabbanim. So why did he think that it would continue to evolve?
Well, the very fact that he has this attitude about the proper way to serve God, and yet he has to acknowledge that the rules by which God is served are developed by humans, creates a problem. As I said, at one time he had hoped that halakha could evolve in a way that would deal with the issues that it largely had ignored because they had no relevance to Jewish daily life. But I think he was scared off by what he saw in the religious Zionist community, that it was totally idolatrous to him. Yes, Mike?
So thank you very much. I learned a lot. One of the things that just struck me was your quote from Ben-Gurion, where he was assuming that the state could control religion. It didn't occur to him that religion could control the state.
Yeah, that was a blunder.
Yeah. He was the one that gave the military exemption, thinking, 50,000 or 6,000 students is no big deal.
Yeah, they were miskenim, they were largely survivors of the Shoah. And that they would be dependent on him for handouts. Of course, it was hard for Ben-Gurion to acknowledge that at some point he would no longer be prime minister. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I also learned an awful lot from him. Did he ever interact in any way, or maybe they could have traded perhaps, with Kahana? Because there were a lot of discrepancies, but they both had that very sharp view on Tzvot as the basis for everything, with no allowance to deviate.
Right, but that's as far as it went.
Right. I was wondering, did they ever have any type of they ever acknowledge one another, I guess, is what it was a better way to phrase the question.
I'm not aware of any, and I think, well, part of the reason, I'm not sure that he would have appeared with Kahana. And I'm not sure that, take religious Zionist leaders that are not nearly as extreme, I'm not sure that they would have appeared with him. Because he was merciless. I mean, he would tell them exactly what he thought of them. So I don't think so, but that could also be a function of the fact that Kahana was not high on anyone's guest list for broadcasts. Any others?
Reshit Smichati Latenu, there's this version where you can insert the word Sheteher. Sheteher Reshit Smichati Latenu. It's not now, but maybe in the future it will.
Right. And I don't think Leibowitz would have been satisfied with that. He would have said, it's still idolatry. To even hope that it would be is idolatry. Okay, Roberta.
Question. Did he have a relationship with David Hartman?
He quotes David Hartman a couple of times in his essays.
Positive or negative?
Positively, favorably. And he sometimes referred students for further study to Hartman. What the nature of the relationship was beyond that, I don't know.
But he didn't last.
No, he considered Hartman one of the good guys, apparently.
And I'm just trying to remember, I'm not so good at dates. Was he still alive when the Israelis pulled out of Gaza?
No, he died in 94.
Okay.
And it will down in 2005.
Sure, that would have been. Thank you. Okay.
You know, he thought that the great powers, you know, Russia, US, France, Germany, would impose a settlement on Israel and Palestine. And and he wanted to head that off because he thought whatever it is they came up with was not going to last, was not going to work. Yes.
Ask a question. Of all of the personalities around the founding of the State of Israel through the history of the State of Israel, what is it? Is this a particular area of interest, and what kind of prompted you to delve into this particular person's life and philosophy?
Well, his name kept coming up. I mean, I would see references to him. And at some point, I had heard that he was the Orthodox professor who opposed, you know, the occupation. And that just made me curious to know what was the basis for that. And how did he see what was coming immediately after the war?
It was very interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't really know much about it before. Thank you.
The war being the Six-Day War?
Yeah.
David, this was great. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you. Who's next? Okay.